The agenda this week talked Turkish politics with Nobel Prize-winning author Orhan Pamuk and examined the Supreme Court's decision to allow testimony given about abuse in Canada's residential schools to be erased. The agenda's Week in Review begins by putting a spotlight on men's health.
Generally speaking, men are going to die earlier, they're going to live more years in poorer health, and they're more likely to have advanced diagnoses of such diseases as heart disease, having heart attacks, strokes, etc. So again, I do think it speaks to the fact that perhaps men aren't necessarily addressing their health concerns at a proactive early stage.
Would you grant that?
I absolutely would agree with that.
Yeah.
In fact, we're seeing less of a focus on youth, on adolescents, and on men between the ages of 21 and 51. They're not going to the doctor unless something really hurts or unless there's a really big rash, when women are actually driven to the doctor for different reasons, such as they're in the birthing years or they're premenstrual. Men are waiting, and the late diagnosis is what we're really seeing an increase in our particular industries.
So men are just not proactive. That's part of it.
Not proactive.
Okay, let's get over here to Andrew Simon. There are, as we know, we see them all the time, wellness campaigns directed at men and at women. More at who?
I mean, the reality is we see more female, more women, but they're both. The question is, what is most visible and what is, we just came off of Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Obviously a very big to-do. It's changed dramatically over 10 years. I worked in the space, and I always look at it and I say, wow, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have pink everything. Now you can't turn, you know, and it's the NFL, and it's
Major League
everywhere.
Baseball.
It's everywhere.
Canadian Football League.
Yeah, so some people say like, oh, now there's a pink backlash, if you will, and that's always going to happen. Something raises something, you know, what's being ignored. So for instance, there's communities such as metastatic cancer, which is stage 4 cancer, very different cancer, and that community is underserved. So now one community feels very served and another feels underserved in relation. So it's quite interesting.
Dean, let's go back to this notion of who seeks care and under what circumstances. You're a urologist.
Yeah.
So when do men come to see you?
So generally speaking, we have two sort of a bimodal distribution. We're going to see young men coming in just at the end of adolescence, maybe with some things that have carried over from when they're in their teens. Testicular cancer is predominantly between 18 to 35. But generally speaking, we see men coming into the office as they get to about 50 and plus. And often it's because they start to have urinary symptoms, the prostate becomes enlarged, and this may be their first point of contact with the healthcare system for many years. So when they're in their 30s and 40s, they're busy, they're working, they may go to the doctor every now and then, but they're really waiting until there's something that really pushes them, forces them into the doctor's office, and it's often the urologist who they see.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. By the time they see you, what percentage of your patients see you when it's quote-unquote too late?
Well, hopefully not as many as we used to see. We're doing better in terms of diagnosing, say, prostate cancer earlier with PSA blood testing, and the awareness has certainly increased. But a lot of men do come in with fairly severe symptoms, and they've ignored it, and they've put it off, and it's really that final straw that's brought them in, or their wives have finally said, come on, I'm taking you to the doctor's office.
You got a bit of upper lip stuff happening. Is that a Movember thing?
This is day 3 of Movember. Yes. Thank you for noticing. Thank you. Yes.
How about, you look like you're doing the Movember thing all over.
I do a whole, yes, I am. I wish what's lacking up here, I put over here.
Very nice.
Yes.
Do campaigns such as Movember, in your judgment, work?
100%. They work. And
they work to do what?
Well, this is the question. And and it's always the question of any campaign in marketing. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to get to? So many campaigns do awareness. And awareness is wonderful, but awareness is not action. So the question is, and action doesn't mean just I'm growing a wonderful mustache. Action means, am I donating money? Am I going to the doctor? Am I checking an online tool to find out if I might be more susceptible to a particular disease, et cetera? So certainly in marketing, advertising, communications, we're always looking at what do we actually want people to do to change their life, change their behavior. Because it's great to know something, but it's very different. It's like knocking on the door versus going into the door.
Now, Movember clearly raises awareness. We've got people who, you know, go for the mustache thing during that month. Is it supposed to do more than that?
It is, and it does. It raises a lot of money and beyond the awareness. And the website for Movember is wonderful, and they've learned over time, and things progress. I mean, people always point to the Ice Bucket Challenge, and they say, "Wow, that was fantastic." Some people don't know it's for ALS. It got people to take action, and that's always the case. The question is, what are we doing to whether raise money or making people aware of things? We do at Edelman, we do a trust barometer. We've done it for 17 years internationally, and it's been really fascinating to see that trust has dropped among government, media, institutions. It's increased among people that we know, people like us. And so that's where we look to our social media people and we say, like, what are they doing and why should I care?
So you say these campaigns are working. My follow-up for you is, are men therefore healthier as a result of these campaigns?
Absolutely. So I'm going to agree with you and say the campaigns are working. And men are becoming more healthy. What they're doing is they're seeking advice. They're seeking care from their physicians. But what we're also seeing is there's still that bravado out there. There are still those men that don't take advantage. October, Breast Cancer Month. There is a significant amount of men, from a percentage perspective, that have breast cancer.
The subject of fathers and sons is also popular in Japan, also popular in Russia, because countries like Japan, Turkey, and Russia imposed modernity, and a fast modernity. And the modernity we saw, say, in France in 200 years, we saw in my part of the world, them in 50 years, where then you can identify the great change with generations. And the difference between fathers and sons is not arbitrary. It's a generational change, and it's a dramatical change. And then it overlaps with Westernization and criticism of it. That Ottoman Empire, Ottoman and Turkish ruling elite realized that Westernization is the only way to save the country. But there was, of course, a conservative resistance to it. That set the standard for politics for 200 years.
Let me ask you about that, because there is a point in the book where you praise the Iranians. Here's from the book. The Iranians were not like us Turks, who had become so westernized that we'd forgotten our old poets and myths. It sounds like you're expressing sadness for the fact that Turkey is sort of losing touch with its Ottoman roots.
Yes, I argue that modernization should not necessarily be about forgetting. You have to rewrite old myths again, write them and give them a modern outlook. In fact, that's what I'm partly doing in this book. That's what I did in My Name is Red, my black book. That is, modernization is not for me forgetting the medieval past, medieval text, old text, but in whatever, call it modernist, postmodernist way, rewriting, appropriating them in such a way that it sheds light to what's happening today in a deeper manner.
Your novel, of course, spends a lot of time, I guess, comparing and contrasting this tug of war between the draw of Turkey to the east and the draw to the west. And you feel it strongly, obviously. Is it felt as strongly in present-day Turkey as you suggest in the book?
I think in politics in present-day Turkey went bad in the last 2 years after the military coup, I think 16 months ago. Before that, there was normal democracy going on. Yes, political Islamist party was gaining and successful, but then partly they were successful. Also, they were good in economical boom. That is, they were founding water. But in the last, especially last 16 months, 130,000 people were fired from their jobs. 50,000 people are in jail. Some of them, my friends. Again, 180 journalists are jailed. Some of them my friends who are novelists too, but they're not in jail for their novels, by the way. And most of the time, they're in jail for their journalistic activity, criticizing the government too much. In the end, that doesn't really sound like a democratic country. I believe there is no democracy without free speech, and free speech is disappearing in Turkey. What Habermas would have called public sphere, unfortunately, where you can freely discuss country's problem. You may have leftist point, you may have conservative point of view, you may have this point, secular point of view, Islamist point of view. That space is unfortunately disappearing. But I didn't write this novel to point that out. I do interviews sometimes, and as I tell you too, I write my novels, try to understand deeper structures, try to understand, as I treat them now, as Carl Gustav Jung treated old stories, calling them archetypes. In a way, I'm trying to understand increasing authoritarianism in Turkey through old myths in the manner Freud would have, or Carl Jung would have approached the problem.
But your protagonist in this book would have felt very comfortable in a Turkey that was allowed to be a part of the European Union, right? He is a wealthy businessman, more liberal values, et cetera, et cetera. The way things are going, is Turkey ever going to be in the EU?
Not in the last 5 years, it was clear for everyone that unfortunately we're not going towards Europe. But in the last 2 years, now we're going away from Europe. I am also, okay, if we stay where we are, in between 2004 and 2008, I was involved in promoting, making propaganda for Turkey, for EU taking Turkey to the European Union. But it didn't work out. Perhaps Sarkozy and Angela Merkel did not want it. I cannot criticize them too much. But now, I accepted, I didn't cry about that, I accepted the fact that Turkey is not going to join European Union, say around 2014-15. But now we are going even away from the other direction, which I'm very upset about.
Kathleen Mahoney, I want to know what your reaction was when you first heard the unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of Canada that would permit the destroying of the records of those who want them destroyed.
Well, first of all, Steve, I would say that the characterization of this case is better described as being about consent, ownership, and self-determination, as opposed to destruction, because destruction is just an outcome of those fundamental principles that are embedded in the agreement. So I was participating as a representative of the AFN in the negotiations, and that was what the bargain was that it was a very clear agreement with Canada that these documents, especially the IAP testimony and the decisions, would be utmost confidential documents because they contain the details of horrendous abuse that are humiliating, embarrassing, all of those things. And it was up to the survivor as to what they wanted to do with them. So their consent is front and center in this whole dispute as to whether or not Canada gets to decide or whether or not the survivors get to decide.
Sure, and we've
the
got to figure
agreement
out
said
where
the survivors and the court said the survivors. So I applaud that because it goes down the road of human rights, self-determination, and the dignity and human rights of the survivors themselves.
We do, you're quite right, have to figure out where the balance of responsibility sort of lies here and whose rights are supreme. And let me get Ry Moran to come in next and follow you up by asking you where you believe the balance lies.
Well, as I think Kathleen has said, this is a very complicated case, and everything that she has said about self-determination, Indigenous rights, human rights is absolutely at the center of this case. One of the challenges that we've kind of uncovered in this case, though, is we're now 10 years into the process, and many survivors were not provided that choice before. Many survivors have passed on. That has left the collective group of organizations and survivors now in a position of trying to figure out what the most respectful, most honorable thing to do is with these records. Certainly consent is paramount. Certainly consent is a very important element of this entire discussion. The transcripts are one of those records. But we do need to ask ourselves, what about the decisions that were rendered? What about those decisions that were rendered by adjudicators in the interpretation of law? Is that the same as a survivor transcript? Is that a different type of record that's important for this country to understand?
And let me follow up with the gentleman beside you. Eugene, what's your view on where the onus of responsibility lies, to the values of the survivors or to the historical record? What's your view?
Well, first of all, I'm very I guess, conflicted with all of this. I'm very happy, as are most survivors, that consent was achieved. But the process in achieving consent was a process of re-victimization to Indian residential school survivors. And by that I'm talking about the arguments put forward in the Supreme Court that day were about protecting our privacy. And when you look at the summary of student-on-student abuse, indicating that it was only in the area of 30 to 40%, and then you have the clergy abuse and the staff abuse of students over 60%. It really makes me wonder whether our privacy was a priority, or is this a process of destroying Canadian history? Because too many have passed on to provide consent.
So I'm hearing from you, Eugene, that it sounds like you're saying you are more concerned about history being airbrushed out as opposed to the rights of those who are testifying. Do I have that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's any type of erasing of history, any type of censorship or sanitizing of history as it relates to Indian residential school survivors is plain wrong. And we're supposedly celebrating 150 years. And we can't allow this to happen in 2017. This true history has to be continue to be preserved for generations to come.
Mike Kakagi, you're hearing some of the complexity of this debate on this very program already. Where do you come down on it?
Well, listening to both Kathleen and Eugene, and I have a lot of respect for both of them on their opinions, but you're getting one that's based on legalese and another one coming from the grassroots. And I always have a tendency as a First Nation person to connect with the grassroots more closely than I do with the legalese. An elder once said that my history is on my lips. Okay, now having taken that and extending that and looking back at this whole process with the Indian residential school, and you can see the contradiction in that. And like our elders say, when I speak for people to hear me. And we're an oral society, so when you have history come back and re-engineering who we were over 130 years, and at the end of it all saying, well, one of the bases of your culture, the cornerstone of the culture of who you are, is your oral history, we're going to take exception to that now.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, November 10th, 2017. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page. That's periscope.tv/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.